Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today actually marks 4 years of me starting to edit my photos. And I feel like I've picked up a few things along the way, and so I thought a good way to celebrate today would be to walk you guys through how I edit my photos. So the first thing that you have to understand is, as far as photography goes, it is a personal thing. It's more of an art than anything else. And just like any other art, the way you go about doing it is subjective. I know a lot of people think that editing your photos isn't true photography. I don't happen to share that belief. I think editing your photos allows you to share the world in a more fascinating way. It's not only about showing you where I was or what I was doing or what I saw. It's about showing you how I felt in the moment. But anyways, with all that being said, let's jump right into Lightroom and get started. So we're in here in Lightroom, and the first image that we have is the image of an antelope, I think. I don't know, but that's the one that we're working with. So the first thing that I would do when I enter Lightroom is probably look at the profile over here. I like to shoot in a more neutral profile. I basically just go into my settings and take down the saturation and the contrast, so I can add that in later. So the first thing I'd go and do is change the Adobe neutral profile and find the Adobe color profile. You can find that when you click browse all profiles. You can see that Adobe has a bunch of different options. I generally just work with the color and the neutral, so I would change that to color and go back. So now you can already see that we have a little bit of the color back, a little bit of the contrast back. We'll start working from here, and we'll first focus on the light tab. Okay, so while we're in the light tab, you can see we have exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. So we're gonna target each one of these individually and just go or work our way down. So for the exposure, I don't want to change the exposure too much on the image. I think it's pretty well exposed. So I will take it down just a slight bit to give it more of a darker feel. I do think we should increase the contrast up a little bit, but not by too much. Basically just bringing a little bit more life into the image. So moving on to the shadows. For the shadows, what I want to do in the front part of the image is sort of just lift the shadows a little bit higher to make the image a little bit brighter. And I also want to lift the whites. The whites is essentially just taking the brightest parts of my image and moving them towards pure white or true white, right? So I'm going to move that up a little bit. And the reason that I'm doing it on the whites to make it brighter as opposed to exposure is because if I were to lift the exposure, it would raise the exposure of the entire image, which we don't really want to do because it looks kind of shit. That's why we do it on the whites. And with the blacks, I think I am going to crush the blacks a little bit just to bring back some of that initial contrast that we really liked before. Now, I'm not going to take down the blacks too much because you can see that it does tend to get a little bit more grungy or distorted, which is not really what we want. We just want a little bit more contrast back into the image. So we're just going to leave it right about there. Okay, so when I do get to the color section, I see that there are 3 distinct sliders. There's hue, saturation, and luminance. So what I tend to do is I only tend to mess with the hue and saturation. I don't really touch luminance that often. There are instances where I might do that, but yeah, I don't really mess with luminance too much. My general strategy going into color is I will mess with the hue slider like left, right, just to see if there are any like main colors in the image. Right now, I don't just really see any prominent colors in the red section, so I'm just going to reset that, leave it as it is, and move on to the orange. In the orange, you can see that we have a lot of oranges in the photo, primarily affecting the subject. So now, obviously, I don't want them to be too green, and I don't want them to be too red either. Sometimes it's just about making some minor micro adjustments to, you know, where you want the colors to be. I'm not gonna make too many adjustments on the hue slider, but I am gonna up the saturation just a little bit to bring back some of the more rich orange tones. I don't think I need to mess with luminance on this one, so I am going to leave that alone. Moving on to green. So sometimes what I do like to do is using the hue slider, you can actually change, like for example, green colors to more warm orange colors. And this is particularly helpful when you're taking images with, let's say, trees or grass or whatever, and you want to make it seem like, let's say, a more autumn vibe. I tend to like a more autumn vibe, so I do tend to change these greens to a more like warm orange, more like dry sort of feel to the grass. So I'm gonna go ahead and add that right now. I'm not gonna do that too much on this side of things because we do have 2 more green sliders coming up, but I am essentially just doing the same thing as I did with the first one. So I have done a little bit of an adjustment on the first green slider, but as you can see, there's still still parts of the image that are still looking a little bit green, but they do seem to be more darker green, so we can just go up to this slider and do the same thing over here to be able to get them to be a little bit more dull, a little bit more of that, autumn vibe. Moving on to the blues in the image, we can see that through the edits, we have made the top part of the image a little bit cold, a little bit blue. I don't really want that for this image. I want it to be more warm and dark tones. So what I will do is bring up the hues on this one to make it a bit more of a colder look. But on the blues, I am going to take the saturation all the way down. So you might be asking, Arman, what's the point in adjusting the hue if you're going to take the saturation down? That's a very good question. But the answer to that is that they're two different colors that we're targeting. The same way that red and orange might be mistaken as one or similar colors, these are two different colors that we are adjusting. So adjusting the saturation of one doesn't affect the saturation of the other. So there you go. Tidbit, fun fact, pro tip, whatever you want to call it. Obviously in the image we don't see any purples or magentas, so we're not going to touch those, and we're just going to move on to the next part of the image. So the next tab that I generally look at is the effects tab in Lightroom. Three main ones that I tend to mess with are texture, clarity, and vignette. Now, don't mess with these too much because they can make your image look really, really bad, but they can also make your image look really, really good. So mess around with these, see what you like. I generally don't tend to add a lot of texture because it makes it look a little bit too blocky, edgy, refined, or whatever. Clarity can do the same thing. It does mess with your colors a little bit, so you might want to be wary of that. And then vignette, I'm sure a lot of you know, is just adding a little bit of a black border around your images to sort of just focus the attention a little bit. So what I tend to do is increase the texture just a little bit. I tend to zoom in so I know how much texture I am adding to the image. Just a little bit for you to see the fur come to life, and a little bit on the clarity as well, because it does tend to add like a little bit of grunge that I like in the image at least. Now I do tend to add a vignette to my images when it calls for it. I feel like this one does. I'm going to add a little bit of a vignette to focus in the attention onto the main subject over here. Not too much. I don't want it to have a full black border like that. So I am just going to do a little bit of a tiny adjustment to bring in focus. So one of the last things that I do on an image to make it look good is come back to the curves. I know I said like I don't mess with curves a lot, but I do towards the end because there's one particular edit that I do like making. And it is adding like a more dreamy, almost less contrasty look to the image. So if you go to your curves adjustments and you basically just drag your pointer up and to the right, and you can add it as much as you want. You can see that you're adding a little bit of a fade to the image the higher up you go. Now obviously there are limits to this, like the more you do it the worse it looks in my opinion. But if I add just a little bit of a fade to the image, I feel like that does tend to brighten it up a little bit more. And I think that's it. I might go down and maybe bring the contrast down just a little bit, or make other minor adjustments to the color, maybe bring the saturation down just a tad bit overall. But other than that, I think this image is done. Okay, so this is the second image that we're going to be working with. Now, I've already explained the color aspect of it in terms of lights, the effects, the colors. We've already gone through that, so I'm not going to go through that again. So I've already added them over here, and so this is where we're going to start as a baseline. So now, the next thing, depending on the image that I like to do, is add some masks. Now, this doesn't apply to all images, but some of them you do want to highlight some areas and dim some others. So now I want to bring a lot of focus to the pyramid in the center and take away a lot of the focus that is on the ruins on the bottom left. Bring some focus onto the road that's next to the pyramid, because I just think that's a pretty cool feature to have over there, and might I say one that's not talked about enough. But so that's what we're going to try and do with this image over here. So the first mask that we're gonna add is a linear gradient. So if you go down to your masks tab over here, that kind of looks like a coffee filter or like a net or whatever, you will find a linear gradient option. So if you click that, and then essentially you can just click wherever in your image and drag up, left, right, depending on however you want your mask to look. I sort of just want to cover this bottom area to be able to give it some less definition. You will notice that the mask fades as it goes up. up, so you might want to take that into account because the effects are not going to go at a hard line. So I do want to take away some focus, so I'm going to bring the exposure down a little bit, not too much. I'm going to bring the contrast up because that will make it a little bit darker as well. I don't want to make it too dark, so we might bring the highlights up as well. But shadows, I think I'm going to take down. Whites, I'm going to take down. And I'm going to crush some of the blacks just to give it more of that dark look. Now, we're just doing this so that we get a sense of what the image looks like. We are going to take out all of the ruins over here later. But the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to add a new mask, and I'm going to call a brush mask. I'm going to increase the size of the brush just a little bit, and then, oh, that's too big. And paint down the road. It is a more of a feathered brush, just like the mask, so you might want to take it a few strokes at a time, but you can essentially just paint the road or whatever it is that you are masking. And for the road, I want to bring a lot of the attention back to it. So for this mask, I'm going to increase the exposure just a little bit, bring the contrast up a tiny bit, but I don't think there's a lot that I need to do, especially now that we've darkened the bottom left. So I'm just going to make some minor tweaks here and there, nothing too crazy. Okay, I think that's good. So the next thing that we're going to do is actually take this photo into Photoshop to edit some things out, primarily being the ruins over here. You might ask, Arman, what was the point of the mask if we're going to take it out in Photoshop? That's a fair question. But like I said, we did that so we have a feel for the image, because the way that we're going to take this out requires you to have a baseline of what you want it to look like. Okay, I'm going to show you two methods, the way that I did it and the way that you can do it now. So let's get into it. The way that you want to take this image into Photoshop is essentially just right-click on the image, and you'll have an option that says Edit in Photoshop. You can click that, and then it's essentially just going to open in Photoshop. I'll show you two ways of doing it. The first is the way that I did it, but now you guys have it kind of easy. So the first way that I did it was to take out all of this nonsense, is that I went to the clone stamp tool. I increased the brush size a little bit using the bracket keys on your keyboard. You can press Alt or Option on your keyboards and select a target area. So for example, I can click the sand over here and then just use the sand to essentially brush out a lot of the ruins. And I can just go like that and take out all of the ruins. But that obviously took me a lot of time, but you don't have to do that because AI and stuff, so yay. Instead, what you can do is just click L to select your lasso tool, whether it's the polygonal or whatever. I like the polygonal because it's a little bit more precise. You just select everything that you want out of your image, click generative fill, type in remove or whatever. You don't even have to type anything out most of the times, and just click enter, and then give it a few seconds. And just like that, it's gone. Okay, it doesn't look great, but it is a very good baseline from before, because you don't have to paint for like 3 hours. Anyways, so you can cycle through the couple options that it gives you. This is great. This is a really good option. I'm not gonna lie to you, a lot better than I thought it was gonna do. This is a great option. It looks good. I like it. So we're just gonna click Command S. I leave these options as is. I just click OK because this is essentially, yeah, that's fine. This is essentially just saving the file onto Photoshop, and then it'll import back into Lightroom, and then you can continue editing in Lightroom from there. You can just close the image over here and then swipe on back to Lightroom, and you will see the photo has imported into your Lightroom for you to now edit. We will go back and do some more editing onto this because it did take away some of our darker edits. So we'll go back to our masking, we'll add a linear gradient, and we'll do exactly what we did, add a mask there, and decrease the exposure a little bit, decrease the contrast a little bit, bring the highlights up, put shadows down, whites down, and blacks down. Now I did say that the highlight of this image is the pyramid. So what I'm going to do is add another mask, and this is going to be a radial gradient. So the radial gradient is essentially just a circle that you can apply to your image, highlighting the portion that is the centerpiece. So these outer borders essentially just decide how far you want it. The inner borders will decide more of the feather that you have on the mask. Now I do tend to like a nice feather so we're not like bleeding into the sky, because the circle, as you can see, isn't perfect. We can rotate it around just a little bit to see if we can help alleviate some of that spill, but for the most part it seems like it's gonna be pretty stuck. We'll essentially just go add a little bit of exposure to the pyramid, bring back a little bit of contrast, bring up the highlights, crush the shadows just a little bit, bring up the white, and crush the blacks just a tiny bit to maintain some of that contrast. Now, as you edit the image, you might see that you want to increase, the size of the mask or decrease the size of the mask. You can do that because, as you can see, that it updates in real time. So I'm just going to increase the size of that just a tad bit to cover the rest of the pyramid. And I think that's it for me. I like where it is. I think I'm going to leave it here. I don't think there's any more edits that I would apply to this besides the little cloud fairy story thing that I told you about using the curves. So you just drag it up, drag it to the right, and add a little bit of a fade to the image to give it a more dreamlike, a more fairy feel to it. And there it is. That is how I edit my photos. Like I said, a lot of it is about feeling, so there may have been some decisions that I made that you didn't agree with, but that I really liked a lot, and that's okay. Another thing to note is that it is okay to copy somebody else's style, especially when you're just getting started. My workflow is heavily inspired by another photographer named Brandon Wolfo. I don't know if I'm mispronouncing his name, but I took a Skillshare course of his back in 2020, I think, and I haven't looked back ever since. Obviously, I make my own adjustments to see what I like, but like I said, it is okay to steal like an artist. Copy somebody else's style, but put your own spin on it. Go ahead and experiment with a bunch of different sliders, tabs, and styles, and eventually you will find your way. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to drop a like down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.